Notre prochaine intervention est celle de Mazi, Javidiani et de Natalia, Lebedinskaia. Je vais vous présenter en fait les deux conférenciers pendant qu'ils préparent leur présentation. Donc, originally from Tehran, Mazi Javidiani has received his Bachelor in Fine Arts in New Media Arts and Cinema from Concordia University. He is currently an active researcher at the Sense Lab, a Montreal-based research creation lab. Mazi's work is composed primarily of new media narrative installations based on new cognitive philosophies and traditional Sufi and Buddhist practices. Mazi has also been an active film writer, specializing in Deleuzian philosophies, formal approaches, and Middle Eastern cinema. For her part, Natalia Lebedinskaia is a second-year MA student in art history at Concordia University. Her research focuses on vernacular photographs and their shifting meaning in public collections. In her thesis, in which she discusses the Makartov family collection from the Doukhobor community in British Columbia, she hopes to bring forth the role of personal agency in negotiating between tradition and assimilation. Natalia's wider interests include ethics of display and curatorial responsibility as they relate to nostalgia, memory, and representation of personal experience. The title of their talk, if it hasn't changed, is Green Photographs and In Moving Memory. So.
Thank you. And I would like to echo the apology for my extreme Anglophonism. So if I speak too quickly or anything, just sort of gesture to calm down. So in June 2009, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was re-elected as the president of Iran in a highly disputed election, as you can see in this photo. The election campaign had started a few months earlier when Mir Hossein Mousavi announced his candidacy. Known as the prime minister of the wartime era, when he handled the economy with relative success, Mousavi had since been openly critical of the current government. He received the support of most reformist parties, along with other intellectuals who had sanctioned the elections in the past. A few weeks leading up to the election, live television debates were broadcast, causing a great amount of anticipation and enticing many who had never gone to the polls before to vote. Many of the taboos were discussed in the debates, and the power structures of the regime were publicly criticized for the first time in the media. When, to everyone's surprise, Ahmadinejad was re-elected, the results and the way in which they were announced created high levels of suspicion in Iran, creating a public outcry. In the days that followed, millions marched the streets peacefully, and in spite of the government's ban on the rallies. Protesting the results and forming into what had become known as the Green Movement. In an effort to contain these protests, the government imposed extreme measures of control. It heavily filtered the internet, disconnected cell phone connections, seized licenses from opposition media and foreign journalists, and violently encountered the protesters. Hundreds of people have been killed and thousands imprisoned in the protests and the raids that have followed them. More than a year later, the Green Movement remains as an active force in Iran, shaped by the memory of the mass protests and the violence that followed them. The Iranian society, which had already gone through a bloody and violent revolution in 1979, and which continues to struggle with its successors, has become cautious enough not to seek a solution in yet another revolution. Rather investing in studying velvet revolutions, the Green Movement reinvents itself without leadership in creation of new modes of civil resistance. So writing anti-regime slogans on banknotes, such as this one, this one, this one, and I'll get Mazi to translate this one, for my Persian is quite rusty.
This one is really interesting, because before, with the blue color, it was written death to Khamenei, who is the supreme leader, and somebody crossed that out. And then again, somebody else wrote on the bottom that the atrocity cannot be erased with color. So it's like this conversation.
Yeah. Here's some more, and here's some more. Then green graffiti drawn on walls, underground newspapers and secret distribution, anti-regime flyers, and strikes are some of the methods that the protests have evolved into, with a nightly rooftop chants at the cusp of them. As an integral part of the emergence of the Green Movement, photographs and videos taken by cell phones and digital cameras, and their distribution through Flickr and YouTube, served as evidence of what was happening while helping the movement gain its force. As the government was publicly denying the scale of the protests and limiting access to means of planning and communication, photographs were simultaneously a way for the outside world to witness the events, and for the government itself to organize and comprehend its own scope. Through their multiplicity and defiance on the bands of documentation, these photographs stood apart from traditional journalism in their power to foreground the connecting fabric between the photograph and its referent. As the physical reality of the events was collectively and largely anonymously recorded, the protesters were consciously implicating themselves, their subjects, and their audiences in the political acts of photographing and being photographed. They placed the spectators, regardless of their geographical location, among the protesters, creating an ephemeral community around the photograph's production, viewing, and distribution. Thousands of photographs that narrate the emergence of the movement and the violence of its initial protests remain archived on Flickr, Facebook, and YouTube, and continue to occupy a position which is much more complex than that of simply evidence. The photographs form an active collective memory that defies historicization by operating in a rhizomatic rather than hierarchical fashion. In doing so, it allows for reconstruction of countless individuals' personal experience of the events and places all other manifestations of the movement in a response to its initial force. So, what is to be done with the archive of these images, as well as blog posts, Twitter updates, and stories told through Facebook status updates? How can we situate ourselves as their audience, forming a position that answers to their continual role in the movement? And how do such traces of an event contribute to its collective memorialization? In what ways can this memory differ from its official story? In the last year, two major libraries have initiated projects that appear to provide a sense of security that the information will not vanish. The Library of Congress in Washington announced on April 14, 2010, that it will acquire the Twitter archive, while the British Library echoed with a move to preserve blogs and Facebook updates as part of its collection. Neither of the projects directly answers to the protests or to the visual material, and there is really not very much information about the details of either one. However, both try to attempt an absorption of the vast amounts of this information into already existing research institutions. In that, they take on the role of presumably validating these sources as being worthy of being preserved for posterity as historical material. For this reason, opening the discourse of preservation in relation to the photographs from the Green Movement threatens to mark it as a completed event, of which the archive is evidence and of which we are historians. This paper is our attempt to locate a different way of viewing, one that positions the images and their archive as active agents in the events, whose meaning continues to develop as the movement shifts its goals. Viewing the photographs and the collective memory of the protests in the present as a dynamic and engaged is integral to understanding the movement's potential as not realized through the protests, then documented and historicized, but as a continuously building system. Our question, therefore, needs to shift from how the archive can be protected for the future towards how it can continue to be understood in the now. The thread of a fixed history here replaces the thread of forgetting. While we may have the tools and technology to preserve the archive, these tools make the photographs into representations of a past event. One has a stable interpretation and a completed history, removed from the current manifestation of the movement. However, if the images and their interpretation cannot be fixed, and our engagement with them is viewed as a continual unfolding of the same event that we're witnessing, then the position that we occupy as historians and as individuals who remember are positions of very heavy ethical responsibility. The power of the images from the Green Movement lies in their resistance to being fixed in this linear time and space. Unlike the possibility of distance, which is allowed by the official archives recontextualization, these photographs are not removed and placed in a neutral space or classified according to a familiar and independent system. Instead, they constitute traces of the events as they were happening on the blogs, Flickr, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook albums. They're instances of not knowing, of confusion and chaos, of making plans, sharing warnings, and personal accounts. They're Facebook groups dedicated to recording the names of the disappeared, imprisoned, and killed protesters, linked to their profiles in personal photo albums. All photographs of the protests were made against the bans on documentation, and despite the danger of identification for the photographers and their subjects. Thus, our act of looking at these images is very intimately tied to the position of responsibility towards the photographed, not as bearers of witness, but as participants. In looking through the archive and reading the minute-by-minute reports with dozens of images that accompany them, or for example, videos now in those reports that have been removed from YouTube with marks that it has been removed due to copyright infringement, but this happens to all of them. So you realize it is not copyright infringement, so there's that pang. I'm confronted with my sudden closeness to these events and my simultaneous inability to grasp them. While singular photographs may contain in them the potentials of being every other image that I had just seen seconds earlier, there's no safety in their singularity, framing, or editing. Each photograph extends and overlaps into a myriad of other ones. The dizzying quality of them is multiplied by the cameras that keep appearing in each one. At the same time, it is impossible for me to talk about the photographs as a unified whole archive, as that position would not allow me to acknowledge the power of individual multiple gazes that have confronted me. A physical sensation of tragedy replaces my urge to locate the events in a specific time and place, to comprehend it historically. The event is now, and it is being moved forward through the power of the photographs, neither singular nor plural, to create affect. In order to view the photographs of the protests as an actively constructing entity, which constantly escapes beyond our reach through our engagement with it, would like to turn to Gilbert Simondon's theories on individuation and their connection with Bergson's ideas on memory. As Simondon proposes, information is not a given thing, but a tension between two orders in a state of disparition, incompatible realities on the cusp of becoming a system. This incompatibility, which marks information as relational, also forms the organizing dimension along which the individuation occurs. Information is a relationship here between a set of tensions that are able to produce a new system of organization, based along the impossibility of its own stability. Returning to our archive, it can be read as a tension that produces the desire to construct the photographs of the Green Movement as completed entities, driven by a temptation to locate a stable set of reference. In acknowledging the responsibility and the danger of writing such a fixed history, we can position ourselves in relation to the archive of the images in such a way as to preserve their effective force. It allows us to shift attention away from a resolution and onto the tensions that find their fleeting balances. In that, there is a potential of looking at the archive as a response to the structures of memory, as opposed to that of linear history. So now Mazi and his very theory bits.
Memory is movement. It is movement as duration is essentially memory. Movement not necessarily in time, but rather in density. It is the movement of thought, a dynamic process always in transformation, always mobile, always in moving. Memory is not the past of the once was, but the past in the making, constantly reshaping and reconfiguring, therefore never final. Never fully actualized, always in potential. By focusing on Bergsonian concepts of memory and Simondon's notions of individuation, we are able to enter an alternative realm where no longer we may find the necessity to consider a photograph a documentation of a fixed and completed past. Bergson attributes two types of movement to memory, rotation and contraction. What we are supposed to visualize is a telescope that we are pointing up at the sky. Thus, when I'm trying to remember something, I at first see nothing at all. What will help us understand this image is the idea of my character. When I try to remember how my character came about, at first I may not remember anything. No image might at first come to mind. Pure memory for Bergson precedes images. It is unconscious. But as I try to focus, as if rotating the rings that control the lenses in the telescope, some singular images come into view. The second type of movement that Bergson attributes to pure memory is contraction. This movement can also be explained through the example of the telescope. What a telescope does is that it narrows down the image so that the image of a whole constellation would fit into our eye. In other words, the past is always in its totality. Quoting Deleuze, not only does the past coexist with the present that has been, but as it preserves itself in itself while the present passes, it is the whole integral past. End quote. Referring back to the cone diagram, thus each section of the cone includes not particular element of the past, but always the totality of the past. As we move toward the present, the past in its totality becomes ever more contracted, ever more dense, which is why remembering is not so much movement of thought within time as it is within densities of the past. Both these movements of memory can be seen in relation to photography in our attempts to anchor spectatorship in the act of remembering. The structures of the online archive allow for the movement of rotation, which is focusing, and contraction, from the act of trying to reconstruct the specific events through individual images to their totality. Engaging with the photographs brings the memories into focus, a recollection of direct engagement for those who were present in the streets, and a recollection of indirect engagement for those who followed the news carefully. At the same time, remembering the events involves contracting the mass of images into an affective experience. It is the superimposition, and metaphorically, of all the images into a whole, a multiplicity that extends beyond the frames of singular, never fully actualized and never contained within a single narrative, and perfectly capable of inducing an event. While contraction refers mainly to the nature of memory, the rotation is more about remembering. Remembering, as Nietzsche notes, always involves forgetting. Forgetting is that which enables the remembering to be expressible. Without forgetting, memory falls into, quoting Erin Manning, the infinitely regressive search for meaning. This brings with it a nihilistic will to power that holds to pre-imposed association, making superficial links between a pre-constructed then and now, bridging regression into a linear flow. Such nihilism holds onto the past as though it could be transported fully formed into the present, as though it could be known as such, and recreates the present in its image. Then it polices this image, holding it to its unchanging self, the being of the what. To think of the past as fully formed and transportable to present is to think of the past as it has been. It is considering it a being, while it is in fact a becoming, always in potential. Supposing the past as something fixed, something final, compels us toward thinking what rather than how. While how follows a more transductive approach and offers more openings, what in its totalitarianism presupposes being. The danger of the what as opposed to the how is the danger of preservation of the photographic archive of the Green Movement as a singular historical instance. It is the assumption that June 2009 and the month that followed could be reconstructed as a memory of the event as a being, not an event which continues its becoming through its own memorialization. It is the image of the death of Neda as affixed in its historical significance, as it is acknowledged by the WordPress photo competition jury of this year's prize as worthy of special mention, and archived through institutions under a set of keywords and tries to hold it to its totality in the past. This brings us to the notion of individuation, a concept developed by Gilbert Simondon. Simondon's main argument within the study of individuation is that the individual is never given in advance. It comes into being through a process of becoming, a process through which potentials unfold in different directions. Potentials are at the center of the pre-individual. Not only is the individual not given in advance, but it also never final. Always individuating, but never a fixed, completed being, never a closed entity. Through the individuation, the potentials keep rearranging themselves. They always remain in re-evaluation with the individual environment multiplicity. The individual is never a completed being, as individuation is never able to exhaust all the potentials of pre-individual reality with one stroke. These potentials remain, allowing for multiple further individuations to occur in the future. As I mentioned earlier in relation to Nietzsche and Manning, remembering in its essence is always a form of forgetting. However, it is not forgetting as deduction or induction. Rather, it is remembering in the form of transduction. Transduction, proposed by Simondon as the process through which individuation happens, unlike deduction and induction, does not presuppose being. It studies the pre-individual and the becoming of the being. It is neither a reverse nor a replay of ontogenesis. Unlike deduction, it does not filter out the characteristics of the reality within its own domain only to extract the resolving structure. Unlike induction, it does not only retain that which is common, eliminating that which is singular. It begins at the center of the being and expands in various directions from this center. It is pursuing of the being in its becoming. It is as much the peripherals of an event as it is the event within the frame. A singular photograph's frame marks the boundaries of remembering and forgetting along which the photographic event unfolds. What remains outside the frame is a myriad of potentials that did not become resolved in the process of individuation of the single image. They remain on its periphery and have the capacity to provide new tensions and incompatibilities, thus pushing the process of individuation forward, or encountering other images that destabilize them and create new potentials. In the sheer quantity of the photography of the Green Movement and their overlapping frames, the existence of these potentials is made manifest, drawing our attention to the movement as it continues to individuate through our act of viewing. Thank you.